May Day protest, it's a tradition across the world. People are protesting always on May Day. And I think we're keeping the tradition alive. But of course, we've got something very important to protest about this year. Shortly, we're going to have some music. I hope if Lackadaisy are around and they can say hello to me. But before we move on to some live music, we're going to have a very good speaker, an excellent local activist, trade union activist in Unite the Community, one of the founders of the Eastbourne People's Assembly, joined with us to help found Eastbourne Stand Up to Racism, and is going to now talk to you about the history of May Day and all of the stuff around that. Oh, here she is. I was looking at her. Carol Mills.
This Eastbourne rally is just one of a number of similar rallies being held throughout our country, where communities and towns like ours have come together to defend our right to protest and to kill this bill. Our rally today is supported by local groups who have come together in solidarity, united in our outrage against this bill. Solidarity and protest is the pivotal strength of our movement. Unity is our strength. And I want to talk about unions and about May Day and about public outcry. Why do we have unions? Unions came about in the 18th century when workers came together to organise against poor paying conditions, and always running alongside workers organising were the repressive acts of the ruling classes. Unions grew anyway, and the repression along with it. And at times, martyrs were created. So we have the massacre at Peterloo, the Battle of Peterloo, and we have the suffragettes, and we have the Toll Puddle martyrs, where agricultural workers' rebellion in 1834 was crushed when 6 of their leaders were deported to Australia because they swore an oath to be a union. And that was against the law, and they were deported to Australia, and that crushed their rebellion. And their fight is now memorialised in a fantastic celebration down in Dorset, the Toll Puddle Martyrs Festival, every year. Now, the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution and the deplorable conditions in factories, this saw the growth of the numbers of unions and of our strength. And so what the state had to do then, they had to find a way of imposing their dominion, and they did this by legalising them, not to help them, but to set limits and controls on what workers could and couldn't do. That sounds familiar. This bill is just the same old stuff being played out again, the same old story, keep those workers down. Now, trade unionism is not part of the school curriculum. So young people they're unschooled about unions, and that's the way the state wants it. But there are ways around it. My union goes into schools as extracurricular activity, and we teach unions to kids. So we get round it. But what do unions achieve? It's with the power of unions that we see workplace fights for better pay and conditions being won. You may remember the Wetherspoons, the McDonald's and the TJ Friday strikes of 2018. There was a whole series of coordinated strikes against poverty pay. Is it that? 1, 2, yeah. Now, one of the main organisers of those strikes, he wasn't long out of school, and he didn't know what a union was because he wasn't taught about unions. But he found a flyer lying around, and he Googled it. And from there, the young people that worked in those fast food outlets, they joined unions, they organised, they formed branches, they organised national strikes, and they won their fight for a living wage. And they also won their fight to have unions recognised in their workplace. Now, that win that those young people, not long out of school, that win was really uplifting for our movement. Now, these strikes were run by young people, as I say, who weren't taught about unions. But when they realised they had to fight for a better world, a better life for themselves, they found out about unions. So, if you're not in a union, please join a union. Now, I want to say that unions are really growing under COVID because the fight for safe conditions is being played out. And I want to tell you about the National Education Union. Now, they broke all records. They had the largest online political meeting in the UK ever. They had nearly 500,000. There was 400,000 people joined into their meeting when they were trying to arrange a safe return to school. And 700 of their members were in that meeting, and they got 600 new members overnight. So unions are growing because... What did I say? I always do that. 6,000 new members overnight. And they won because parents, children, and people like me and all the teachers stood in solidarity, and they won that fight, and the government had to do one of their U-turns. Now, there's power in solidarity, and there's power in our strength and standing together, and there's power in not being divided by our divide and rule overlords that they would like us to be. Bloody rain. Look at that. I just want to say a bit about May Day, just a bit. This, as Keith said, this is the most important day of the year for workers all over the world, and it's International Workers' Solidarity Day. And the day came into existence because they were fighting for an 8-hour working day, and that's how it happened. And all over the world, that tradition has been kept alive, and where May Day becomes a focal point for workers' demonstrations and fights, and sometimes those fights go beyond the law at different times of history. But what I'm saying is the true spirit of May Day is being kept alive by people like us here today, and it's not being commercialised and turned into a colourful tourist attraction and denuded of its power. You know, we're showing what May Day is about. But finally, a bit about public outcry. Now, we're only allowed to hold this gathering today after the illegal, spontaneous vigil that happened at Clapham, after the death of Kate Everett, and the public outcry by the state repression that happened on that day. And so, all of a sudden, we're allowed to have legal protests again. But then comes the bill. And so what they want to do is make sure they pick and choose which legal protests they allow. So we don't know what's ahead of us. If public outcry and protests do not derail this bill, there may come a time when we need to protest beyond the law. And people say, oh, we can't do that. You know, but it was necessary at different times in our history. It was necessary for the poll tax riots and for suffragettes and the Peterloo massacre. It became necessary. And Martin Luther King, what he says about protest beyond the law is protest beyond the law is not a departure from democracy, it's an absolutely essential part of it. So my message to the establishment today is do not underestimate us, do not underestimate the power of our organisations, do not underestimate the power of our solidarity, and do not underestimate the power of united public outcry. Solidarity, everyone.